Welcome to Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of security and networking. I'm Drew Conry Murray. JJ's on the road dispensing security wisdom and wit at a variety of conferences, but she'll be back on the mic next week. On today's show, we're going to dive into CVEs, or Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. Now, CVEs are kind of such a routine aspect of tech that most of the people listening probably take them for granted. But like many things we take for granted, the CVE process takes some serious organizational infrastructure to function. So on today's Packet Protector, sponsored by Cisco, we're going to talk about the organizations and processes that drive the CVE system. We're also going to get a behind-the-scenes look at Cisco's own Product Security Incident Response Team, or PSIRT, to find out how Cisco identifies and validates vulnerabilities, and then works with that broader ecosystem on disclosure. There are some who say that the number of CVEs a vendor discloses could be used as an indicator of software quality or lack thereof. Our guests from Cisco assert that this is a poor assumption, and they're also going to make the case for why. Speaking of Cisco, our guests from Cisco are Joe Malcolm. He is CISO for Infrastructure Engineering, Marco Cassini, Incident Manager at PSIRT, and Osman Hashmi, Principal Engineer. Folks, welcome. And Osman, I'll throw the first question to you. As I mentioned in my intro, a variety of institutions and organizations support and drive the CVE process. Let's get some background on these organizations and their role in this process.
Absolutely. Thanks, Drew. And thanks for having us on the podcast. So as I mentioned, I'm a principal engineer in Cisco's Infrastructure Engineering Business Unit. I'm part of Joe's team. And my primary focus is to support the development teams working on the various NOSes, specifically the Nexus operating system, to ensure security compliance and to assist in the evaluation and disposition of security issues. So this is really close to home. Overall, when we look at the variety of institutions and organizations that are helping to drive the CVE process, we need to look at the bigger picture. So MITRE Corporation, obviously, that's your nonprofit that's founded the whole CVE program, I believe, back in 1999. And then we basically go to MITRE that maintains the CVE list, and they also manage and provide the impartial technical guidance to the CVE editorial board. Cisco, by the way, is the CNA authority, which is your CVE numbering authority. And based on our coordination from the CVE dashboards that are published on NVD, which is your National Vulnerability Database, we do get a good assessment of exactly what type of vulnerabilities are out there that could affect our products, and that basically starts our process for evaluation. So in terms of how we interface with some of these institutions, obviously MITRE Corp is there. The CVE databases on NVD is basically a starting point. And mostly what we are looking for from these different organizations is to really get a good assessment on what is the data that we need to look at. So we're looking at CVE enrichment. That is part of the mandate for NVD, where they add attributes to CVEs such as the vulnerability, and Marco's going to cover how do we actually assess that in terms of the CVSS scores, and any other data that can be added, which is publicly available information that the NVD team would curate and enrich that particular vulnerability offering. So they would add data like CWEs that we'll cover, and they also add basically what is the scope. We'll cover exactly how to distinguish between various scores, but the main essence here is that if a bad actor was to compromise the system, exactly what is the impact and what is the scope and how much damage they can do.
Okay, so we talked about MITRE Corporation and the National Vulnerability Database. I believe the Department of Homeland Security is also involved, yeah?
That is correct. So overall, there's the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, there's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, which basically derives some of these frameworks. And then there's other organizations that we've been working with, specifically in Europe and other parts of the world. So it's all about compliance, and it's all about overlapping requirements. But at the end of the day, if you really focus down and drill down on CVEs, there's a basic set of parameters that we're looking for in order to assess the vulnerability of our products.
We spoke about MITRE Corporation, which is based in the US. Are there other organizations that focus on a similar thing, that do a similar thing to CVEs in other parts of the world, like Europe or Asia, or has everybody sort of adopted the CVE format?
So most have been using CVEs as a universal language. There is a new effort in Europe, thanks to some new legislation, where they're starting to issue their own identifiers. So remains to be seen how that goes. But at the moment, it looks like they'll have their own parallel set of identifiers for vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I just want to jump in. So as far as I know, they all still use CVE, right, as the unique identifier, right? Like duplicating the CVE would help, but I think it's more potentially a parallel to what NVD is doing in the US, right? That's probably what the EU is also working on. But yeah, when it comes to identifier, I think the de facto standard in the industry is like one vulnerability is identified by one CVE, right?
Right. So you mentioned National Vulnerability Database. We talked a little bit about it. Can you drill down a little bit more into the role it plays in the CVE system?
Absolutely. So overall, the NVD is the entity that provides analysis on CVEs. So this could include assigning the severity scores, which is the CVSS score. And they would also help us determine what is the type of vulnerability. So overall, when you look at the overarching framework, NIST is the entity that operates and manages the NVD database.
Okay.
Essentially, it's a factor of establishing what are the frameworks and guidelines and any best practices for vulnerability management. And for an organization like Cisco, we refer to NVD to actually figure out what is the impact, how do we assess for vulnerabilities, how do we mitigate for weaknesses, and NVD's data and enrichment efforts, basically, which aligns with the NIST's broader mission to enhance cybersecurity. That's really helpful. A couple of things that I want to add to this is that NIST also maintains a CPE product dictionary, which really means that you know exactly which products could be affected for a given vulnerability. And we use this data extensively to understand exactly how to split between various operating systems. As you know, Cisco has several operating systems, but also to have an index into that search to see what is the history of issues and what's the trend of issues and what kind of issues could be impacting a particular product family. So typically, NIST NVD maintains a CPE list that uniquely identifies a given vendor product, including Cisco's.
As Osman said before, right, from when it comes to Cisco, we are a CNA, that's the CVE numbering authority. We definitely use NVD enrichment data for third-party vulnerabilities, but when it comes to basically issues in Cisco authored code, we are responsible for the data, right? So we would assign a CVSS score and identify what are our affected products and all this contextual information. We supply that directly to MITRE, right? That's typically what a CNA would do, right? And there's been some recent changes on MITRE side to display all that information. But yes, NVD is still useful for kind of enrichment for more of like third-party software CVEs where there's not a CNA, right? And maybe that information is missing. So NVD is still playing a role there for sure.
Overall, I mean, we can look at it this way that NVD is the comprehensive and trusted source of truth for vulnerability management data. And this really helps us with automation of vulnerability management, security measurement, compliance, and everything associated with managing the lifecycle of that CVE. So yes, NVD does help provide analysis on CVEs and scoring, as well as enrichment data, as Marco mentioned. But I think it's one of the references that we use in order to understand exactly what vulnerabilities might exist in any of our given product or feature offerings.
So it's kind of like a sort of neutral, trusted source where all vendors, all companies can go to say, what is the process? We've identified this bug. Is it a vulnerability? How bad could it be? It provides a framework that everyone can use.
That is correct. Although I should put in a disclaimer that NVD, when the enrichment is done, they do use essentially all publicly sourced information, which means that if there's public information available or a website that talks about mitigation or weaknesses or attack vectors, then all of that public information will be used along with a specific CWE identifier to determine exactly what's the scope of that specific vulnerability. So NVD is helpful in figuring out exactly, what is the scope and how would a particular issue or vulnerability affect a particular product. Internally, as Marco said, because Cisco is a CNA authority, we do our own level of analysis and enrichment as well.
So what does it mean to be a CNA authority in the context of CVEs?
It means you are a trusted vendor, right? That is registered with MITRE, and it's allocated to disclose vulnerability for their own authored code, right? For their own products. So basically, at the beginning of the year, as a CNA, we get a batch of CVEs, right? Numbers, and then over the year, for any new vulnerability we find in our Cisco authored code, we would ourselves associate that particular CVE to that particular vulnerability, and then associate that other information, right? The affected products, the CVSS score, associated CWEs, all that contextual information, we can provide it directly to MITRE. So that's how it works.
So just to add, right, just to complete that thought process. So in case where there's either a dispute or we don't know where exactly the responsibility might lie, in that case, the CISA organization, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, they actively participate in the CVE program and they serve as the CNA of last resort, which means that they would assign a CVE identifier for vulnerabilities that are reported to the CISA.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if I'm a software or hardware company and I think I've got a vulnerability, but I'm not a CNA, how do I, actually produce a CVE?
Yeah, as Osman said, right, there are CNAs of last resort, right? You can work through MITRE, right? And then, they will assign a CVE if there's not a specific dedicated CNA that is in scope for that particular vulnerability. Yeah. So
Okay.
there is also a delegation process, right? I don't want to go into too much level of complexity, right? But there's even CNAs which then have a higher tier CNA, right, which helps them. So yeah, there's a whole structure, right? The MITRE site has some very deep details about how the whole chain, how it works. But yeah,
Okay.
depending on the situation, there will be someone responsible, basically. And if there's nobody, there's a last resort.
Yeah, sort of like a certificate authority system where there's layers and levels and
Yeah.
different levels of authority. And it's a similar thing with CVEs.
That is correct.
There's one other important role of CISA in the ecosystem, which is that they declare some CVEs as being known to be exploited.
Mhm.
So this has regulatory implications for the US government, but is generally used as an indication of high priority for fixing or mitigation by the wider ecosystem.
Right, that's the KEV database, right? Known exploited vulnerabilities.
That's right.
Yeah, and that CISA is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency here in the US.
Yeah, they're a part of DHS.
Yep. Well, so just to wrap up on this ecosystem question, because there are a lot of moving parts here. If I'm a company, I think I have a vulnerability. What are the steps that I go through?
Absolutely. So overall, like if we're focusing on the CV enrichment process, that would help any particular entity determine what's the scope of that vulnerability. Essentially, the task is with NVD. There's a group of folks in NVD that are tasked with enriching each CVE once it's been published to the CVE list. So it's been pushed to the NVD database. The enrichment process includes adding any critical metadata information that we already covered, like common vulnerabilities scoring system, the CVSS metrics, also any common weakness enumeration, the CWE identifiers, and they also kind of add attributes for the common platform enumeration, the CPE, so that you can uniquely identify exactly what's the scope, if there's any publicly disclosed information available from vendors or in the industry about what's the scope of that vulnerability and what are the mitigation, as well as which unique product would that vulnerability apply to.
So we've mentioned CVSS, that is kind of a risk score or a sort of urgency score applied to CVEs. How do you get a CVSS score? And I'm also curious, like it's a number ranking. So what means something's an 8 versus a 10 and so on? Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, sure. So probably many of the followers know that, but just to give some context, so CVSS is a standard that was defined by the FIRST organization, that is the Forum for Incident Responses and Security Teams. And Cisco is an active member of it. Actually, let me take the chance to give a shout to my colleague Nick, which is one of the co-chairs of the CVSS Incident Group at FIRST.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the main purpose of CVSS is, as you said, right, is to capture the principal aspects of a vulnerability, and through that also come up with some sort of indication of its severity, right?
Right.
So there are different metrics that compose CVSS, but the foundation really is the base score, and that focus on the generic characteristics of a vulnerability, and it kind of assumes the worst case and to define the initial score, right? And then there can be other metrics that can be used to adjust the score based on specific factors if needed, right? But the base score itself, it actually includes two types of metrics. One is the exploitability metrics, and the other one is the impact metric, right? So the exploitability metric is basically, okay, who can exploit this vulnerability? And the impact metric is, okay, if the vulnerability is exploited, then what is the actual impact to my product, right? So if we want to simplify, right, you can say, okay, the easier it is to exploit the vulnerability, or the bigger it is its impact, then the highest is going to be the base score, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to go with that example, right, it could be just a different, like you have two vulnerabilities that are both high impact, but one of them needs authentication to be exploited. The other one is completely unauthenticated. That could be the kind of factor that kind of bumps you, from an 8 or a 9 into a 10, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's an example.
Yeah, I remember reading descriptions where it's like, remote unauthenticated attacker, or,
Yeah.
you need to be on box, you need to have some kind of admin credential to actually exploit it. So that's going to be a factor in weighting the score. You also mentioned impact. How do you determine that? Because impact could be pretty subjective depending on the organization you are and the business you're running.
Yeah. So again, the scope, the base score tries to find a generic, like the worst case scenario, and evaluate the impact there. So yeah, it's the three aspects of security, right? So it's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And it gives either a low or a high impact, right? And that's, to some extent, yes, it can be subjective, right? But at the end of the day, as a responder, we are going to try to, as I said, evaluate what is the worst case scenario and what is the impact to the product that I'm analyzing, right? To give it, maybe a simple example, right? You have a vulnerability that's going to impact the availability of your product, right? So if it's just, one feature that maybe is going to stop working temporarily, then, that feature restarts and then everything, all the rest continues to work as normal.
Mm-hmm.
That, could be a low availability impact in the scenario, while, for example, the whole device goes down and, it takes time to reboot. That's going to be a high impact, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, just wanted to add, in order for us to kind of look at it this way, right, that the scoring might be identical for, let's say, a given set of conditions or attack vectors, but the focus would be on the scope itself. So as Marcus said, right, for example, if exploiting a vulnerability, let's say in a web server, might allow an attacker to gain control of your, let's say, underlying operating system. I think at that point, we've crossed the realm of something that can be mitigated or isolated to that particular vulnerable component, because now you have a system-wide impact. And that would basically promote the score to a perfect 10 as opposed to, let's say, a 9.7 or 9.8.
Does the fact that a known exploit might be out in the wild affect a CVSS score?
Not directly, right? That's a separate factor, right? But it will not impact the base score, right? Let me put it this way. But then, there are other factors, like you have a temporal score, and that might indicate what's the impact on, based on the specific situation, right? Are there exploit available? So yes, those are factors that can be used to adjust the score based on the, on the exploit metrics, on the temporal metrics, right? So yeah, it's part of the factor, but it's not directly linked with the CAV, right? The CAV is really a separate register, right? That indicates that.
Yep. Okay. So that's sort of the broader CVE ecosystem, but Cisco also operates your own product security incident response team, or PSIRT. So at a high level, can you talk about PSIRT's role inside Cisco?
Sure. So Cisco PSIRT, my team really is the dedicated team that is used to receive reports about potential vulnerabilities. Then we investigate it, and eventually we publicly disclose all information about vulnerabilities affecting Cisco products and services. So in this role, we really work with all the relevant Cisco internal or external parties that are engaged in the report. And we have been doing this for the past 30 years, right? So if you go to our public security portal, you will see there's still, our very first published advisory that's been from 1995, and you can see it's still there. So.
And is an advisory that comes out of PSIRT, could it be different from what I would get from a CVE?
We can go through the whole, if you want, life cycle of how this works. But basically any CVE that we identify in our own Cisco authored code, once confirmed and publicly disclosed, we'll typically disclose with the public security advisory, right? And then the security advisory will be assigned with a particular CVE that, as I said, we allocated. We'll push some level of description, of what we have, like a summary of the vulnerability that we have in our advisory. It will also be pushed to MITRE, so it would be available there. But the advisory might have more detailed information, right? Obviously. So.
Yeah. Can we walk through kind of the CVE lifecycle, sort of starting with how vulnerabilities are identified?
Yeah, sure. So vulnerabilities can be found, as you can expect, in many, different and various ways, right? So, it could be simple product users. Someone is using the product and say, okay, there's something that's, is fishy here. Or it could be our own developers doing their, either new code or doing a code review, and they notice, okay, there looks to be a potential security issue here. Or, it could be someone running penetration testing, right? You name it. So it can be many different ways, but, no matter how those vulnerabilities are found, they will be reported to us, and then we'll start the same consistent process to basically review the report and analyze it, right?
Yeah. What's that process like? I assume you have to sort of investigate and determine, there's something here.
We start by reviewing the data that is available in that initial report, right? Make sure, okay, if there's some information that is not clear, can we clarify with the relevant party that has reported it? And then, we work also internally, obviously, with our development team to make sure that the problem is fully understood. And then important, that problem is reproducible, right? So that it can be further analyzed, and then fixed appropriately, right?
So do you have like a sort of one of everything across the Cisco portfolio inside PSIRT to do this validation, or how do you actually test to make sure?
In my role as PSIRT Incident Manager, we are a team of around 30 people worldwide, and each one of us has his own specialization due to interest or past experience or whatever. But at the end of the day, as a group, we have to cover the whole Cisco portfolio, right? Which is large.
Yeah.
So we can have expertise, but we'll take advantage of the all our internal resources, and we work a lot with Osman and his team, right? For example, to make sure that the appropriate engineers in our development groups are engaged with us, and it's a two-side operation, right? We are more focused on the vulnerability aspect, they're more focused on the development aspect, right? And really working together is how we can make sure that the problem is fully understood and all the aspects of it, and that we are on a good track to replicate the problem and fix it.
I assume you have some kind of lab facilities where there's a problem with this version of this software on this chipset. Let's put it in a lab and test it. Is that how it works, or?
Absolutely. From a test perspective, right? Once we have the root cause identified, we do walk through exactly the specific set of conditions, also test for conditions where we would be able to influence or induce the failure to arrive at that end state. It's a series of steps. It's both manual testing as well as automated regression. Once we know exactly what steps we are covering, it's to look at a system from top down like a black box, but also as a white box. The testing can get really involved, but the end goal is that once we identify the specific set of conditions and triggers, then we want to automate those triggers to make sure that our repository of automated testing can grow, and then we can exercise those test cases for a future release so that at least we are covered from a regression perspective.
So you're feeding back into the internal development process, things you're learning inside PSIRT?
That is correct, yes.
Yeah.
Another thing we strive to do when in this process is make sure we have a complete fix to the problem, as not infrequently our first attempt at a fix may not cover every single case. And so we want to make sure as we go through the testing that in the end we've completely fixed whatever the issue is.
Yeah, can you talk about the development of testings and fixes? Because it's one thing to say we found a problem, it's another thing to know either a full fix or a workaround or other things you can do to sort of mitigate that vulnerability. How does the development of fixes work?
I think from the product perspective, I'll let Marco talk about it from the PSIRT perspective. It is a bug. It is a special class of bug, but we go through our usual process to make sure we have a test bed, we have a proposed fix, we get the fix reviewed, we can duplicate both the original problem and demonstrate that when we have the new code in place, the problem doesn't occur. And then we ask the PSIRT folks to review the fix because they can read the code as well and make sure that they agree that we've completely fixed the problem.
Yeah, agreed, right? You covered it well, right? It all starts with the development team, which is fixing the problem, right? And then, obviously there's also, quality assurance team that are going to be engaged in, in testing this. And then, yes, there's us, right? There's a piece of that also, let's just say we're going to, do our own validation of this, right?
And we want to make sure that the end software still does what it's supposed to do, because if we introduce an availability problem while fixing our security problem, that doesn't make anyone happy.
Yeah, that's complicated. Do you then ever collaborate with customers as you're working through these kinds of fixes or remediations? Because with a variety of customer environments and different configurations and different use cases, that seems like it could get very tricky very quickly. Trying to find a fix that also allows the product to function as it's supposed to.
Absolutely. I mean, the customer validation is part and parcel of the final commit. So if you were to take 2 steps back, right? So if you look at a specific bug report for Cisco for a fixed defect, software defect, we would typically mention if there's any workarounds or mitigations available in addition to the point fix that's being delivered. Sometimes validating that point fix in a customer environment is also essential before we can create a software patch that can be installed by the global customer deployed base. So that is always part of our overall validation cycle. So sometimes we would work with the lead customers and provide them with patches for validation in their labs. Sometimes it's done before the patch is published, sometimes it's done after the patch is published, but it's a very collaborative effort.
But for clarity, we're not pre-announcing vulnerabilities
Yeah.
to customers, right? That's a key point.
Yeah.
Everyone knows about the vulnerability at the same time.
Okay, yeah, that's good, I think, to highlight that there is no sort of secret backdoor, hey, there's something happening. It's a public disclosure that everybody has access to at the same time. I don't know if it's possible to do this, but is there sort of an average time from, the report of a vulnerability to a fix and a disclosure? Or is it really case by case?
That's really hard to to come with a number, right? So, it can be very different depends on the situation. Yeah.
It depends a lot on urgency, complexity,
Yeah.
how deeply embedded. I mean, if we have to change firmware, there's an extensive firmware testing process because it's pretty easy to cause the box not to boot if you mess that up. So it's hard to generalize because it really depends on what needs to be fixed.
If you've confirmed that there is a vulnerability, do you wait to announce it until you actually have a fix in place? Or are there cases where it might be like, we just need to get this out right away and we're working on a fix?
Yeah, it depends on the situations. So typically, if it's something found internally, or if we know, even if it was reported by a customer to us, but we know it's not something that is publicly being exploited or there is public awareness, we'll do responsible disclosure, right? So we'll typically, wait to have all necessary fixes to be available before publicly disclosing the vulnerability. Now, if we get to know that something, there is public knowledge, or if there is, live exploitation going, then, we cannot wait, right? So we are going to announce this immediately, if only to let customer know, okay, there is a live exploit of something. So they can either scan for it, or, potentially if there is a mitigation that they can apply it until we come up with a fix, right? So it really depends on the situation.
Sure, that makes sense. Does Cisco have a bug bounty program?
That is really a BU by BU topic. A number of our offerings do have bug bounty programs. I would say probably the SaaS offerings, so the cloud services probably have the most.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, from an external testing perspective, it's pretty easy to get into testing a cloud service.
Right.
Because you don't need any hardware.
Yeah.
Whereas when in case where you have hardware, particularly with some of the big iron products, it's a lot more complicated. It's a tool in terms of how we attempt to discover problems in our products to make sure we get them sorted out as quickly as possible. I think it's probably worth mentioning, I think someone touched on this earlier, we do have an internal pen testing team that looks at our products as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of our internally found vulnerabilities come from internal testing, where we are looking at our own products and evaluating them, and the professionals take a look at it and tell us, okay, here's what we found.
Okay. But in general, it sounds like it's a BU by BU decision. Do we want to have a bug bounty program?
Yeah, Cisco's a big place. So it's what makes sense to the individual teams.
Okay. So we touched on this earlier, but I think it'd be good to dig into, we mentioned third-party CVEs, which implies there's also first-party CVEs. Can you talk about the difference between a first-party CVE and a third-party CVE and why they matter?
Sure. So first-party CVEs are just problems in code that we write, whereas we also have a fair amount of code in our products that is either open source or commercial stuff that we have incorporated. And so for the third-party stuff, even though it's not code that we authored, we have to make sure we understand what's going on with it, because those issues in that and those dependencies can be issues in the product. So we have internal SBOMs, essentially. We'll talk about SBOMs a little bit more in a minute, where we have a component by component list of everything that goes into our products. And then we have automation that matches that to newly disclosed CVEs in the MVD and from other sources, so that we get alerts and we can take a look at them. And in cases where it makes sense, we can issue advisories. This is not the most common type of advisory that we issue, but it does happen. I'm sure Marco can think of a few over the last couple of years.
Yeah, sure. So for third-party CVEs, we do have a public tool. This is the Cisco Vulnerability Repository, CVR, that our customer can use, precisely for that information, right? I know of this third-party CVE, is any Cisco product affected by it, so they can just enter the CVE into this tool and we'll get that information, right?
Yeah.
And now, what Joe was hinting at, if there are particular high-impact third-party CVEs that are in the cab, they're being live exploited, there's a big part of the portfolio that is impacted, then in those particular scenario, we call it like a high-profile scenario, will also generate a security advisory to drive attention that, this is a serious issue that is being live exploited, and customers should take notice, right? So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's complementary to the CVR is also the ability for our customers to get an SBOM. So an SBOM is just the list of components in a structured form that customers can use to take a look at. But then the CVR, which is an online tool, is complementary to that and then allows you to ask questions about the vulnerabilities that may be in them as to whether they're applicable.
Mm-hmm. So if you're using some open source software, some open source libraries, and it turns out there's a vulnerability is found, I can imagine that could get complex given that this is open source software. Maybe it's, maintained by one or two folks or not even that active anymore. How do you handle it when it's software you're using, but is not necessarily in-house that you can actually go and fix it?
Well, in the end, I mean, it's in our product, so it's our responsibility to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
So we do have expertise on a number of important open source packages inside of Cisco. For example, of course, the Linux kernel, which is a fundamental dependency.
Right.
But we have the ability to find additional expertise if we need to.
Okay, so you'll bring in resources if needed.
Yeah, and let me also add, right? If it's really a new vulnerability that someone reports to us or that we find that it's actually, we find out, okay, the culprit of the issue really is in third-party code. We obviously will engage with that third party, right?
Mm-hmm.
Through their, reporting, through their PSIRT, right, or equivalent of it, right, and making sure that they analyze the issue and they take care of it, right, and coordinate with us for sure. And also, we have our own Talos team that does a lot of analysis of vulnerability research on open source packages, and they're also a team of Cisco that interacts with the third-party vendor in those situations. Yeah.
What happens if, you've got some third-party software in there and it turns out there's a vulnerability in that third-party software, but it doesn't necessarily affect your specific product for reasons like it might not be running the right hardware or the right drivers or whatever? What do you do in that case? Do you still issue a CVE or just, what's the step?
We will fix it in a future version of the software, generally, most of the time by upgrading to a newer version.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's not a vulnerability in the product per se, so to your example, if the Linux kernel has a vulnerability in a graphics driver, that's not of great relevance to our routers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's still a problem. And of course, at some point, we'll rev things and get into the future and get rid of that. But it's not something that necessitates an advisory.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But customers can use the CVR tool to ask questions about specific CVEs if they're wondering if they affect specific products.
You mentioned SBOM, software bills of material. Are you getting more requests from customers around SBOMs? Because I feel like maybe it's not that new, but I'm hearing more and more about SBOMs. Are customers interested in understanding all of the components inside, software packages they're buying these days?
We're seeing, I think it's fair to say, more interest from many customers in understanding this better. As some people may know, there was a regulatory requirement a couple of years ago from the US government that vendors, including us, be able to give out SBOMs. And as a result of that, we've just made it possible for customers to ask for SBOMs in general. And I think it's fair to say that people have been asking for them more now than they were a year or two ago.
Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned in the intro, one of the things we want to talk about is this idea of using the number of CVEs as a shorthand for code quality. And you feel like that's not really a fair metric on the Cisco side?
I think it's hard to interpret on its own. There's a huge diversity of impacts of CVEs. Obviously, we have CVS scores or one metric, but that doesn't necessarily tell you how the product is being used in customers' hands either.
Mm.
I think it's also fair to point out that if you have a broader feature set, that also can affect how many CVEs you're going to find. We have as well a policy where we really have a maximalist disclosure policy. So all those internally found things that I mentioned earlier, they go through the same PSIRT process, and if they're validated, then we'll fix them and publish an advisory.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, also, there are other factors on the quality front other than security problems. Availability, as I mentioned earlier, is an important thing. The thing has to actually do what customers need it to do.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing we're concerned about is that if we spend a lot of time focusing on simply counting CVEs, that can lead to incentives that aren't helpful to the overall ecosystem to minimize them. We really would like everyone to be completely transparent with what's going on, because that's the way we can best protect all of our customers and, of course, the broader ecosystem.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. If folks are trying to use CVEs as part of their decision process, you don't want to disincentivize full disclosure. That doesn't help anybody.
Yeah, I mean, we really critically rely on people being honest about all their issues so that the end customers of all this can decide what to do and make sure that they understand their risk posture.
Yeah. Whether the CVE count is fair or not, I think customers are struggling to keep up with the number of patches and remediations and updates. So can you talk maybe about what Cisco's doing to improve product quality and drive down these software and configuration issues that can lead to vulnerabilities and exploits?
Overall, as Joe mentioned, right, we are taking concrete steps, right, to improve product quality. And really the focus is to drive down software and config issues that may lead to all those vulnerabilities and exploits. So we do recognize the challenges our customers are facing with the volume of CVEs. So the approach that we're taking is kind of multifaceted because we focus not just on integrating the security throughout our product lifecycle, but we're looking at it from both design to deployment and maintenance, like the whole lifecycle of that software. So the key focus obviously is our Cisco Secure Development Lifecycle. We call it the CSDL. That's basically the core of our strategy where we're trying to create a repeatable and measurable process that basically increases product reliability and trustworthiness. So we follow a secure by design philosophy where we want to make sure that the security and privacy are basically considered and baked in from the get-go, from product creation all the way through to the end of life cycle. There's also a key focus, and it's basically a top-down focus right from our executive management about security training and awareness. So we've got various programs. One such program is essentially a Cisco Security Space Center program where we ask all developers to complete training. All the new hires go through a rigorous set of security training as well. And then we've also recently onboarded the Immersive Lab, which is a third-party tool which creates opportunities for developers to understand and experiment in a sandboxed environment about secure coding, use of safety libraries, threat modeling, forensics, and a variety of other use cases as well. Speaking of threat modeling, we do have comprehensive plans embedded within our development scoping lifecycle where we go through threat modeling exercises for attack surface reduction for any new features that had come in. The secure coding standards and automation basically derives the feedback loop that we spoke about, which is the learning action, so that anything that is learned as part of a new vulnerability or a new point fix, we want to make sure that we bring that back into our development as part of a unit test environment.
Yeah.
The testing and validation, we're not just relying on inbuilt tools, but we're also using pen testing and tools like Defensix, Codenomicon to run through industry standard test suites. So those are also part of our test efforts for the validation of these vulnerabilities. And then I'll kind of let Joe talk a little bit about our secure by default and secure by design philosophies, but those do complement the overall stance that we have.
Yeah, so for some time, we've had a sort of secure by design philosophy for product development. However, we've also had a very long history, because Cisco's been around a long time, of defaults and protocols that really aren't up to 2025 standards. So we have a new effort we're calling infrastructure resiliency, where we're attempting to go back and deprecate some of the older protocols that really don't match to today's threat landscape, and also fix some of the original defaults that we've been stuck with for a while. We're going to give customers some time to adapt because there'll be some adaptation necessary during this process, but the goal is to make it easier to use our products in a secure configuration.
Can you give some examples, Joe?
Yeah, so for example, one thing we just did is we just shipped TACX over TLS. The original TACX protocol is 20 years old, plus or minus, and it uses MD5 in an insecure way. It's not well protected from people sniffing the traffic as it goes past, which obviously, 2025, that's not a good idea.
Right.
So TACX over TLS essentially takes that and means you can run it over an encrypted transport so that you can protect the back and forth communication between your TACX server and your networking devices.
What about things like, Telnet?
Telnet is also going to go away, or at least we're going to make it harder. You have to actually choose to have it on your device. By default, certainly nothing we have actually responds to Telnet these days, but we still have cases where the command Telnet is available. And so we're going to make that a bit more challenging to access. SNMPv1, which has been obsolete for 30 years on the products that support it, it's going to go away. And we're going to have let's say a phased effort to get rid of SNMPv2, which is 20 plus years old as well.
Okay.
I can also sort of very quickly add, so, as part of this effort, it's a multi-step process, right? But, one of the initial process part of this, we have some hardening guides, right, for all our major operating system, IS6E, XR, and XOS. And those hardening guides have all been revamped recently. So they're available either through our Cisco security portal or through our trust center, which has reference to that infrastructure resilience initiative that Joe was talking about.
And let me emphasize for everyone whose blood pressure shot up when I mentioned getting rid of SNMPv2, there will be a transition period because we do know that people very commonly use SNMPv2 even today. So there'll be some time.
How much time are we talking about? Are we months, years, or?
Years. But I think for that one in particular, we will first make SNMPv2 read-only and disable the read-write stuff, which is actually not a common use case anyway.
Mm-hmm.
As well as add a bunch of warnings and so forth so that it's apparent to people when they're running and using these SNMPv2 and the other protocols that they're using something that is going to go away at some point. And then eventually it will go away. Or for some products, perhaps it'll be an optional package for those people who really need it.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. And are you aware of any like broader industry efforts that might be useful in improving sort of product quality or software development across the industry and across vendors?
I think first and foremost, the attention that this area is getting these days is really helpful to make sure we all get sufficient attention. As security professionals, there's always tension between spending money on security and on other things. And so the attention to this is pushing things in the correct direction. I think that there's a lot of promise from a lot of these new AI tools to help us weed through a lot of the chaff and be able to focus the human beings on the most important items.
Well, I was wondering if we're going to make an entire episode without saying AI, but I guess maybe since you opened the can.
I had to put it in there. It's a law.
How do you anticipate AI being applied to, what you're doing at PSIRT or across the CVE landscape? Do you see use cases there?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, we are looking at the options to augment all that we do with AI for sure. So yeah, it's still in our early phases on our side, but yeah, we definitely are looking at how to take advantage to like automate some of the work that we're doing for sure. And let me also, just to call out, since we are talking about AI, I know you had our very own Omar Santos on your podcast earlier this year.
We did, yes.
Yeah, he's really leading our AI initiative in Cisco. So I just want to say, if for people interested into that, I can only recommend, that earlier podcast you had with him. It touches a lot of other topics that may be of interest, like, machine readable information about vulnerabilities and yeah, AI. So give a shout to Omar.
Thanks, Marco. You're doing my job for me.
From a product perspective, obviously there's a lot of AI assisted coding tools and also things like automated generation of test cases that I think show a lot of promise. I'm also very interested in using it to find the needles in the haystack that require our attention sooner. I think we're dealing with products with many, many millions of lines of code. There's always a challenge with that. But of course, the LLMs can look at all the code for us.
Yeah, I could see that. But I'm also thinking, obviously these AI coding tools were trained on older code that maybe had mistakes or bugs or exploitable elements in them. And are we just going to end up, sort of repackaging that because folks are vibe coding and just taking what got spit out?
You can't escape the human code review. That's still important. And of course, human testing and so forth. And yes, indeed, the tools, you cannot trust everything that comes out of them. Very early on, I saw a paper that indicated that misspelling of comments produced the coding tools at the time to produce worse code.
Mm-hmm.
Presumably because in the training set, misspelled comments also meant worse code, which was counterintuitive beforehand, but after I thought about it a bit, I kind of wrapped my brain around it. So I think we'll probably find some additional surprises like that as we dive into this topic.
One thing, Joe, I wanted to add is that it's not just about like finding new stuff. It's also about making sure that the old stuff doesn't get shored into a release, right? So example would be we are using for certain operating systems, the GitHub Advanced Security modules, right? Which does go and make sure from a secrets protection perspective that, there's nothing being leaked like the API keys or credentials.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it's doing some sort of security vulnerability assessment and dependency scanning, which is really important. So yes, as part of certain development lifecycle, we're also using the GitHub Advanced Security modules, which does help.
It's another set of eyes in a way, not exactly quite like having humans look at it, but it scales very well.
Well, thank you, Joe, Osman, and Marco. I love getting sort of a behind the scenes look at one, this broader CVE process, and then two, what Cisco does internally. So thank you for that. And thank you for being a sponsor. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for another episode of Packet Protector. If there's a topic you want us to cover, or you have a comment, a correction, or question, please reach out at packetpushers.net/FU. The FU is for follow-up. We really do love when listeners reach out. And just to let you know, Packet Protector is part of the larger Packet Pushers podcast universe that includes more than a dozen technical podcasts for professional development on networking, security, IPv6, DevOps, and more. We've also got an industry blog, 2 weekly newsletters, our community Slack group, a YouTube channel, and an IRC group. You can find it all at packetpushers.net, always free with no login required. And as always, thanks for listening.